Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today for the NALEO Educational Fund political briefings in conjunction with the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. I'm Arturo Vargas, Chief Executive Officer of NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, a national membership organization of Latino public servants and their supporters. They're made up of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, all working together to advance an agenda of full Latino participation in the American political process. I'm also the CEO of the NALEO Educational Fund, a national nonprofit 501c3 organization that works every day to implement that mission and vision of NALEO. And while we continue to work on promoting a fair and accurate 2020 census, we're also focused on making sure that Latinos are able to have a full voice in the 2020 election cycle. Part of that work is to help inform both the media and political actors, candidates, campaigns, and the public at large about the role that Latino voters can have and will have in a particular election. So normally, we would be in Milwaukee this week, and then later we would have been in Charlotte to conduct these briefings on the Latino vote and the elections. We've been doing this since 2000. It's become a tradition with the NALEO Educational Fund to present projections of the Latino vote, to highlight some particular interesting elections where Latino voters could make a major difference, and then to have a conversation about the impact of the Latino vote and to place the Latino electorate in context for the current election cycle. And that's what we intend to do today in these two briefings that we're doing. And for the first time, these briefings are being conducted in English. And then later today, in about 2 hours, we'll be repeating this session in Spanish. And we're able to do this because we have a tremendous partnership with our national media partner. So I would like to thank our national media partner for this event, Comcast, NBC, Universal Telemundo, for their support of our organization and for these briefings. Telemundo has been instrumental in our efforts to promote the full participation of Latinos in the American political process by making sure that their viewing audience and their listening audience and those who follow them on their social media platforms are fully aware about how to participate in American civic life, be it the census, becoming a citizen, registering to vote, and to vote. So Telemundo has been a phenomenal partner in helping us carry out our mission. I also like to thank Bayer US, who is our patron sponsor, for their support of today's event and their commitment to our organization. Thank you also to our presenting sponsor for our briefing series, Microsoft, for their dedication in uplifting support for Latino leaders across the country. Their commitment to our organization has been vital in allowing us to fulfill our mission and to bring timely, relevant training opportunities to Latinas and Latinos in elected and appointed office at the municipal, state, and federal levels across the country. With Microsoft's commitment, we're able to ensure that Latinos are able to fully participate in the American political process. So please join me in welcoming our good friend from Microsoft, Fred Humphreys. He's the Corporate Vice President, U.S. Government Affairs. Fred?
Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Arturo, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I also want to just applaud Telemundo as well for what they do, as well as Bear there. When I think about a theme, as you have this briefing, I think about a theme we've been hearing a lot this weekend and for a while, the soul of the nation. I can't help to think about the many Hispanic Latinx leaders who have been a part of the soul of this nation. Leaders like AOC, Governor Michelle Grisham, Senator Catherine Masto, California Secretary of State who's going to be on this panel, Alex Padilla, and so many others during this, unbelievable time with a pandemic and with systemic racism and so many other different things. you happen to think about who are those who are making a contribution to society. And you know who those folks are who are part of that soul of the nation? It's so many of the members of NALEO who every day at the local, city, state level are making a contribution to society to make advancements. So on behalf of Microsoft, we are so pleased to support this 2020 election briefing. And it's just so important as you all have this discussion. Vote, vote, vote. Increase participation, make sure that your voice is heard. And there's no better way of making sure your voice is heard but then at the ballot box. With that, thank you for the opportunity to bring some welcome remarks to this important discussion. Thank you, Arturo, and thank you, NALEO, for all that you do.
Thank you, Fred, and it's good to see you, if only virtually. You know, before we got this briefing started, we were chatting amongst ourselves, and Fred himself was commenting on how now that we made this transition to doing virtually all of our work online and working remotely, we're actually able to reach much larger audiences in the work that we do. And, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, we held the virtual NALEO 37th annual conference, and we had over 1,200 people participate in that event. And normally we would not be able to get that many people to travel and to make the expense to join us for a single gathering. But as we gather in this virtual space, not only are we here in this moment live, but many of you will be able to see these as they're recorded and they're placed on our websites. And through the magic of technology and the help of companies like Microsoft, Fred, we're able to make our information much more accessible to a much larger audience. So thank you, Microsoft. And again, thank you all for joining us. Now, before we start this briefing, and I invite our moderator and our panelists to join us, I'd like to share some data about what we see happening this year with the Latino vote. As I mentioned at the virtual NALEO 37th annual conference that we just held, we had a conversation about how many Latinos we project at NALEO Educational Fund will vote come November. Now, this is something we do every election cycle, try to make an informed projection of how many Latino adult U.S. citizens will vote. We often are pretty much close to the mark as we look at prior trends and try to take into account different factors that may contribute to Latino turnout in a particular year. Now, this is an extraordinary year, and there are many factors at play that will affect Latino voting participation. Not the least of which is the COVID-19 pandemic and the extent to which Latinos will feel safe and secure to go and vote in person. Many Latinos will probably end up casting a ballot from home and delivering their ballot either through the mail or in person at some voting location. If they vote at home, we need to make sure that they are fully informed and aware of how to cast that ballot from home. Latinos are less likely to vote from home than are non-Latinos, and for many of them, this will be that first experience. But taking all this into account and the outreach that campaigns and candidates will make to try to reach Latino voters, let's take a look at what we believe will be the floor, the minimum number of Latinos to vote in November 2020. Next slide. So this is our national projection for Latino voters that will cast ballots across the country, 14.5 million Latinos. Now this will be a record number. The fact is that every single presidential election represents a record turnout for the number of Latino voters, simply because the eligible population of Latinos who can cast a ballot is growing so fast every single day. As more young Latinos turn 18 years of age and are able to cast the ballot, as well as the number of Latino legal permanent residents who become U.S. citizens. One of the things we know about naturalized Latino citizens is that they tend to outperform native-born Latinos in registering to vote and casting a ballot. Much of this information will be presented in a much more detailed fashion and an upcoming publication that we will release soon, the NALEO Educational Fund Latino Election Handbook for 2020. So stay tuned for that. But for now, we have here data on the projections that we have for Latino turnout by the states with the largest number of Latino eligible voters. So from Arizona to Texas, you can see how the number of Latinos in the electorate are projected to increase in the 2016 election cycle in 2020. Next slide. We're also taking a look at what the performance of Latinos will be in some key statewide races. Next slide, please. Here we go. Now, there is at least one gubernatorial race that we have identified where there is a significantly large segment of the electorate which is Latino in that state, and a competitive election where Latinos can make a difference. That state is actually North Carolina. And there has been a significant increase of the Latino population in that state in the Mid-Atlantic over the past several decades. And today it represents a potent element of the Latino electorate in that state, making up perhaps only 3.3% of the electorate. But given that the margin of victory in the last gubernatorial race was only 0.2%, 3% of the electorate can make a difference. Next slide. These are the races for the United States Senate, which now many believe control of the Senate could very well be in play in the 2020 election. These are the states where, again, Latinos have a significant share of the electorate, and there are competitive or particularly impactful races for the United States Senate. These states include Arizona, Colorado, 2 races in Georgia, since there was one senator who left his seat, and there was an appointee who filled that seat, and now it's up for actual election. So we have 2 competitive races in Georgia. Texas, Senator Cornyn up for re-election, although he had a wide margin of victory in his last re-election race. We know that Latinos have become a significant share of the electorate there, and could be particularly impactful on the outcome of that race. And also, again, North Carolina. So both a gubernatorial and a senatorial race, particularly competitive in that state of North Carolina, again, where Latinos could make a difference. So those are just some numbers. So I'd like to turn this over now to our moderator for today from Telemundo, Nicole Suarez, to be able to guide us in the conversation with my fellow panel. Thank you. Nicole?
Thank you, Arturo. Hello, everyone. How's it going? Thank you so much, Arturo. I am Nicole Suarez, anchor for Noticias Telemundo, and your moderator for today's panel discussion portion of the NALEO Convention Briefing Series. I would like to first take this time to introduce our panelists for today, starting with Arturo Vargas. He's the Chief Executive Officer of NALEO Educational Fund, who we just heard from. Arturo is also the CEO of NALEO and the nonpartisan leadership organization of the nation's more than 6,800 Latino elected and appointed officials. He has held both of these positions since 1994, leading the organizations as they strengthen American democracy by promoting the full participation of Latinos in civic life. We are also joined by Stephanie Valencia, co-founder and president of X Labs. Stephanie is a national leader at the nexus of politics, technology, and leadership development, having served as a senior advisor to President Barack Obama through his presidential campaigns and both terms in office, in addition to serving in leadership roles to various other elected officials and organizations. And next up, we also have political consultant and Democratic Party strategist Chuck Rocha. He is president of Solidarity Strategies. Chuck was a senior advisor for both Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns, and his upcoming book, Tío Bernie, details his historic outreach to Latino voters as part of the Bernie 2020 campaign. Also with us is California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. After being sworn in 2015, Secretary Padilla committed to modernizing the office, increasing voter registration and participation, and strengthening voting rights in California. So we have a lot of great guests today. We also are joined by Cristian Ramos, media and public relations consultant for Autonomy Strategies, Christian began his career working for Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid in his Rapid Response Communications Office and is the former communications director for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And our final panelist is Daniel Garza, executive director of the Libre Institute. Garza began his public service career as a congressional staff assistant for U.S. Congressman Richard Hastings before being elected to the Toppenish City Council in Washington in 1996. Then in 2001, he was tapped by the George W. Bush administration to serve as Deputy Director of External and Intergovernmental Affairs in the Office of the Secretary at the Department of Interior, and was appointed in 2004 to Associate Director of the Office of Public Liaison in the White House. So we have a great panel today, and we have a great discussion ready for you. So I'd like to ask the first question to California Secretary of State, Secretary Padilla. Given all of the controversy around vote by mail, the USPS and the president's rhetoric around these issues, can you tell us what your office has done in California specifically with your vote by mail program to address voters' concerns around mail-in ballots and the integrity of our elections?
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, vote by mail, as we've all been tracking the recent news especially, is going to be even more critical this upcoming election. Making sure I got my audio a little bit better place.
I can hear you perfectly now. Great.
Great. So thank you for the question. And I think it's even more important, not just in California, but across the country, as vote by mail will be more significant in terms of this November's election. Several states have been trying to expand vote by mail simply from an access to the ballot interest in recent years. Vote by mail is offered in most states, but not all. And in some states, it's very easy to qualify for vote by mail. In some, it's a little bit more restricted. You have some states like Colorado and Oregon, Washington, Utah, where every active registered voter automatically receives a ballot in the mail in advance of the election to try to make it easy, convenient. California is moving in that direction for purposes of this November, because on top of all the other ballot access and voting rights issues, we're now working to administer an election in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a lot of people who are not as familiar or not as comfortable with vote by mail, but they should be. So here's what you need to know about vote by mail. It's nothing new. It's been in place for decades. It's proven to be not just convenient, but secure, right? These false allegations of massive voter fraud are baseless. They're outright lies and simply meant to try to discourage people from participating. Expanding vote by mail is going to be critical as we offer more options for voting and protecting your health during this election cycle. So we encourage people to know the rules in your jurisdiction. If you're eligible to vote by mail, I strongly encourage signing up. Request that ballot if you need to. When you get that ballot, get it back right away. Don't take chances with missing any potential deadlines. And one of the safety measures that states do have in place to protect the integrity of the vote by mail process is to make sure you sign the return envelope. Because the first thing that elections officials do when they receive that ballot is compare the signature on file with the signature on that envelope to make sure they match up. If you forget to sign the envelope or the signatures don't match, in some states like California, the county will attempt to contact you to correct that issue, because we want to make sure your ballot is counted. So again, get informed what the rules are, what the eligibility is. You may even have a tool like we have in California where you can track your ballot through the Postal Service in California. So Californians that are watching, go to vote.ca.gov, sign up for Where's My Ballots, and you can either get text message alerts, email alerts, or automated phone messages with the status of your ballot as it's working its way through the Postal Service, both on the way to the voter and on the way back to the county, with an ultimate message of, yes, your ballot was received and counted. So it's great for transparency of vote by mail, great for accountability for election workers and voters and the Postal Service, and ultimately peace of mind and confidence in vote by mail. So a lot more to discuss, but those are the high points. And again, whether it's voting early in person or voting by mail, preferably, the more people we can convince to vote early should translate into shorter lines, smaller crowds, and a safer experience for people on Election Day.
especially now during the pandemic. Alex, thank you so much. So the most important point is to know exactly what the rules are in your state and participate, even if it's in person or by mail. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And now I have a question for Cristian Ramos of Autonomy Strategies. Cristian, what do you think are effective ways to cut through the noise and directly address the challenges facing Latino voters as they head into the polls? Also, how can campaigns establish trust within our community? And along those lines, what do you think Latino voters look for in candidates when we decide who to support? And are the major parties understanding this?
Well, thank you so much for your question. I'm incredibly proud and happy to be here. Listen, the Latino community is hurting right now. There's no doubt about it. We're looking at record levels of unemployment. We're looking at a COVID pandemic that is ravaging our community. People are not able to get tested as quickly as they need to be. And you're looking at food anxiety heading into November, right? 1 in 4 Americans are going to experience food anxiety. They're going to wonder where they're going to get their food in 2020 America. I say all that to underline that there is a lot going on facing this community. People are going back to school, their children. It's unsafe to go to school right now. I myself have a young child, and we're trying to figure out, and we're making it work as best as we can. All that is to say, for candidates, for the parties, for everybody, let's meet people where they live. Let's be authentic, and let's have this conversation in a way that allows you to break through the noise of people's everyday lives. One of the things that Alex really underlined in his conversation is we are voting in a very different way than we have in the past. We are voting in a pandemic. And so we have to do two things. One, we have to really explain how to do that. And I think Alex did an incredible job. But I think the bigger issue here is to reach people where they live, to reach them in a place that presents solutions to the problems they're facing, right? That provides a feeling of safety, that provides a understanding of where they are in this current time. And a lot of people don't feel safe. A lot of people are very anxious about the direction of this country. And so, yes, voting is the solution for all of that. Yes, we absolutely have to vote this election cycle, but we have to acknowledge the realities of America in 2020. Are we better off than we were 4 years ago? I don't think so. And I think, both of the political parties have to sort of acknowledge that, reach people where they live, and help them understand this, right? In a place like Texas, they have to sue the state government to make sure that they're able to, have extra time to vote, to get vote by mail, right? It is not easy to vote for all Americans in the best of times. We are not living through the best of times right now. Again, record level unemployment, a pandemic that's really hitting our community. It's not safe to send our children back to school. Let's make sure to reach people where they live. Let's be positive. Let's provide solutions. Let's be culturally competent, and let's make sure that we're talking to them in English and in Spanish and online. And I think, if we're able to do those things and provide solutions, yeah, absolutely, we'll find a way to increase voting and really make a difference in our country.
Dan, thank you so much. We really appreciate. I also want to move on to a question for Stephanie Valencia. She's the president of X Labs, on the roles women play as trusted messengers within the Latino community. Stephanie, can you tell us about how Latinas play a critical role in mobilizing their families, friends, and others when it comes time to vote? And from your experience in senior leadership positions throughout your career, do you feel as though that dynamic between Latinas and the rest of the community is realized through political strategies?
So, Nicole, let me be really clear. Latinas can be the deciders this election cycle. They will be the deciders. We know that Latinas are deeply anti-Trump. They are motivated to vote. They are seeing what's happening in this country, and they're angry about it. Trump's handling of immigration, the coronavirus, the current state of the economy are all animating issues for Latino voters right now in this country. Two, Latinas make up the largest share of the electorate in some of the most critical battleground states. And young Latinas in particular, those Latinas under 40 years old, are driving that growth. And so we have to tap into that power. Three, the downside is, despite those numbers, over time, we have seen that there are lower rates of turnout among Latinas compared to Black and white women, up to 10 to 15 points. And so that is something that we really have to contend with. So while our community and Latinas specifically are very animated and motivated about what's happening in this country, we have to do all that we can to ensure that they actually turn out. And when we look at like why they aren't turning out, we've seen some research that, shows that yes, Latinas are juggling a lot on their plates. They're taking care of their families. They're juggling multiple jobs in some cases. But one of the reasons that was most surprising to me that I think we can actually do something about is that they don't feel prepared, that they don't want to mess up when they show up to that voting booth. And I actually think that's a real opportunity for vote by mail, and our messaging around vote by mail is that vote by mail presents an opportunity not just because it's safe and secure and a healthy way to cast your vote, but it also provides you an opportunity to be able to do the research that you need to do to ensure that you have the opportunity to look up what candidate you want to support and take your time, not feel rushed. Because we have to create a culture of confidence for Latinas that shows them that they don't need a PhD in political science to participate in the political process. Now, what I'll say to answer your last question about whether or not we're doing things to address this or not, the gender gap that where Latina women are and where Latino men are is the most pronounced it's been in our community in a very long time. The last time it was this big was in the 2012 election between Obama and Romney, where it was roughly 12 points. We've seen at different points this year, it's been anywhere between 15 and 17 points. And so I think there is a new opportunity as we move forward, not just in this election, but moving forward to really activate Latina women and make sure that they know that they are the deciders and drivers in this country, and create a culture of confidence and create a culture of a self-fulfilling prophecy that they can be the deciders in future elections. And so I want to see a lot more effort and attention put into trying to reach and engage these voters, because when they are more motivated and more excited, they won't just turn out themselves, but they will get their kids, their husbands, their family, their communities to go out and vote as well, and have a catalytic effect on our electoral and civic participation system.
And that is the importance of word of mouth. And when you see others around you voting and doing this very important thing, you're like, hey, I need to do it too. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for your input. And I'd also like to invite you at home to submit your questions for any of our panelists right here on Facebook. My next question is for Chuck Rocha, president of Solidarity Strategies. Chuck, based on your work for the Bernie Sanders campaign, can you tell us about what made the campaign so successful with Latino voters? Additionally, as we know, many Latino voters in states Bernie won were much younger than other groups. How did that affect your strategy and the issues the campaign focused on?
Well, thank you, Nicole. And this is an amazing panel you've put together. And I think part of this and what we're doing today is a big part of getting Latinos to vote. You have to go ask them. You have to go to the community. Me and Arturo have been talking about this back to when we both had hair. Like we've been telling the entire community, you have to invest in our community and come talk to us if you want us to vote. People always have this misconception that Latinos don't vote. I've been doing this work for 31 years. And the one thing I can tell you is that campaigns and organizations and the party, either party, doesn't spend the time or the resources in our community treating Latino voters like white voters, like marginal voters, like persuadable voters. And when you do, they will vote. I just finished a book that's released today called T.O. Bernie. And in that book, I go into great detail to answer this question, not so it's ever a secret for anybody, but so it's open source for every Democrat, every Republican, every independent, whoever wants to figure out how to get Latinos out to vote like we did with Bernie Sanders. You can buy my book today and you can go do what we did, which is show up in the community early, spend real money in the community. That means millions of dollars for TV, radio, mail, newspapers, phone calls, texting. That sounds like a lot. In Bernie's campaign, we did all of that. On top of that, we hired Latino consultants to make those products for us. So it wasn't a bunch of woke white boys making the products that they Google translated that was going to turn off our community. It was folks from the community, Latino consultants making those products. And then we went a step further. We hired a bunch of Latino staff to actually deliver those products to the communities. In the Bernie Sanders campaign, we had over 200 Latino staffers. So let's recap. You start early. You have a culturally competent content. You hire a lot of Latino staffers who can deliver that product. You invest in our community, and then you have Latino consultants who actually get those products into the marketplace. This is not rocket science. If you take anything from what I'm saying, if you treat a Latino voter like we treat these elusive, persuasive white voters in the suburbs the same exact way, you'll get 3 times the performance from the Latino voters. The party and the apparatus out there that runs all of these campaigns needs to make a decision. Every election cycle, they defer back to persuading voters that, let's take the steelworker in Indiana who voted for Barack Obama, but then voted for Donald Trump. In a state like Arizona, there's 138,000 newly registered Latinos who have come of age and registered themselves, probably with some help from NALEO, to get out and vote in Arizona. If you'll spend some money talking to that new young voter, I have proven with the book that I just written and the campaign that we ran, you'll get 3 times the turnout from those folks than trying to persuade another white voter in the suburbs.
Every second, we have a new voter that's turning 18 and is eligible to vote. I also thought it was really interesting with the Bernie Sanders campaign, how you had so many undocumented people trying to recruit others to vote for Bernie Sanders. So that was also very, very interesting.
Yeah, and there was a really big key of this, because guess who's motivating the Latino community? It's not the old heads anymore. It's this next generation of activists, and the Dreamer community has drugged the entire Latino infrastructure to them. So guess what? If you hire Latino activists who are organizing in those communities, they turn out to be really good campaign workers.
Well, Chuck, thank you so much. We appreciate your input. And now I'd like to turn to NALEO CEO Arturo Vargas on the issue of investment precisely in Latino outreach. Arturo, how has investment in reaching the Latino community from both major parties changed over time? Also, how do you think this legacy has affected Latino voters? And how do you see it playing out today ahead of the 2020 elections? Oh, I think we have Arturo on mute.
How's that?
Great. We can hear you now, loud and clear.
So political parties have said for decades that they've been investing in the Latino vote, and that they get serious about understanding the role that Latino voters can have in success for their campaigns. But we really have not seen that play out to match the rhetoric. And Latinos have, been part of campaigns going back to the 1960s. I know that in Kennedy's campaign, John F. Kennedy, that is, and Richard Nixon's campaign, there were efforts to organize Latino voters in those national presidential campaigns. But over the decades, the Latino vote now is absolutely decisive. So not to see a significant, robust, meaningful investment from each political party in every single election cycle today, it just baffles me. Now, we're starting to see a little bit more, but I think it also shows up in how Latinos are being asked to participate in the national political conventions. We've seen a few so far in the Democratic convention. I'd like to see how many Latinos will be at the Republican convention next week. And going back to Chuck Rocha's point, and he's right, we've been doing this since we had hair, convincing candidates and campaigns that they have to go out and work for the Latino vote and just not take it for granted. Never assume that a Latino will only vote for a Democrat or will never vote for a Republican, because that's not true. Latinos are a sophisticated electorate. They look at the circumstances of particular races and they vote accordingly. But they have to be invited to vote, and that requires investment. So what worries me about this election cycle is that our most powerful method of reaching Latino voters, and that's person-to-person contact, is now impossible. So we have to rely on other strategies. Traditional media, like Telemundo, is going to be so important to make sure that television and radio are used as media to reach Latino voters, as well as social media platforms and any other strategies that we can. But it requires true investment.
Arturo, I'd like to ask you as well, how is the participation of Latino voters up until now? Are we registering to vote? Are we going to participate in these coming elections 2020?
Well, Again, we will have a record number of Latino voters, regardless of how many Latinos vote in November 2020. If we reach our projections of 14.5 million, it will be a record. One thing about registering Latinos, if they are registered, they turn out at pretty much the same rates as non-Latinos. 80 to 85% of registered voters actually vote. So the big challenge is, how do we get Latinos registered? So the kind of work that Secretary Padilla is doing in California to make sure that voter registration is accessible and easy, that you can do it when you not just go and get your driver's license, but you can do it online. You can do it the day of the election. All these, pre-registering 17-year-olds are strategies to expand the electorate that we need to see replicated in other states around the country.
Thank you so much, Arturo. And finally, I have a question for Daniel Garza, Executive Director of the Libre Institute. Mr. Garza, since your work for the last Republican president before Donald Trump, how has the Republican Party's approach to winning over the Latino community and issues facing Latinos shifted, and where do you think it will go?
Well, first, let me say, well said, everyone, from everybody to Chuck, Arturo, Christian, really insightful stuff. And really, I'm proud to be a part of this conversation. Look, to begin with, believe it or not, there is an enormous conservative and right-of-center Latino constituency out there. Millions watch Fox News. They own businesses that are taxed and regulated. They want to see the centralization of so much power and money and control reversed, so that the individual is empowered, not DC politicians. But more specifically, to answer your question, with respect to the GOP and President Trump, as a political observer, I can tell you that my observations would be that many Latinos saw a candidate who made promises that their lives would improve, that they would have more access to jobs and opportunity, and that the educational options of their children would also improve. And the thing is, people can turn a blind eye, but a lot of Latinos, millions of Latinos, actually experienced that promised betterment. And they saw him fight against really formidable forces to achieve these promises. And they would tell you that a candidate Trump made promises and a President Trump kept promises. So just before COVID forced the government to impose restrictions in order to mitigate the contagion, we saw record unemployment for Latinos and labor participation rates for both Black and Latinos. We saw spikes in wages, especially for the lowest quintile, record home ownership for Latinos. So the economy was on the right direction with a lot more to do, as Christian was making a really fine point on. A lot are still struggling. But talk to these Latinos who will be voting for Trump, and they'll tell you to vote against Trump, who now has a record, mind you. Latinos would have to ignore that record unemployment, record homeownership, increased energy production, less taxes, less regulations, and the economic growth that they saw and that lined their pockets. For Latinos of faith, it's all that plus having to forsake gains in the freedom of religion and freedom of speech, pro-life issues, school choice, conservative judges that were nominated and approved, unprecedented access to the White House, and how expressions of faith are actually welcomed at the Trump White House. And lastly, I would add, to underscore Chuck's point, the investments for Latino outreach from the campaign, from the party, from the 527s have also spiked into the Latino community. They're engaging Latinos. They are connecting more. In fact, I just saw an article where they actually spent more than the other campaigns. And so this is to mobilize Latinos, to engage Latinos. That's exactly what you need to do. Folks who have the shared experience and who can relate, to folks who are scraping their knees, praying to overcome, what is happening right now. This is important stuff. Now, I think what also needs to happen during this time, while these investments in outreach and engagement is being made, the party and Trump, they need to show that they care. They also need to show that their ideas work, and this is good for Latinos. I mean, because we don't want a party that ignores us, and we don't want a party that takes us for granted, which was kind of what happened in the past. So I'm going to end it by saying, does the president have issues with his style? Is he uncouth? Of course. And I think the Democrats do very well in emphasizing that. But what I have listed are not insignificant things. And so I'm not surprised you're going to see a significant percentage of Latinos who are going to come out in support for Donald Trump, and really policy champions in the Senate who are also running in a pro-growth, pro-economy, pro-freedom agenda, like Cory Gardner in Colorado, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, and John Cornyn in Texas.
Well, yes, definitely. Some polls show his support among Latinos near 30%. So very interesting points, Daniel. Thank you so much. I'd now like to call in Christian and Alex again, if we could get them into this chat now to talk about the outreach of campaigns in the Latino community. Christian, if I can ask you to unmute yourself as well, please. And Christian, we can hear from you first.
Sure. So I was just looking this up while we were having this conversation. I went online, I looked it up, and there was a statistic I saw in the USA Today, and it's from Somos and Unidos Latino Decisions. 64% of Latinos have not heard from either political party this cycle. 64%. And if I remember correctly, there was a similar statistic last cycle. And if we're going back to some of the points that Daniel was just making, I think if either of the political parties were to make that their case to the Latino community about the challenges that are facing them with healthcare, right? We got a president who wants to take away their healthcare right now in the middle of a pandemic. We got a president who has, by and large, allowed the economy to slide into record drops in economic growth in the country. I think people would very much want to vote, but you have to ask them to vote and you have to reach out to them. And there's a lot of great organizations like doing that. NALEO is doing an incredible job of reaching these voters and some other folks as well. Mi Familia Vota is doing an incredible job. But you got to do it. You got to ask. The person who asks is always going to get the vote over the person that doesn't ask. And 64% of Latinos haven't been reached out either way. That's a travesty.
Alex, would you like to add to this?
Sure. I'll speak in a minute about the outreach, or campaigns and candidates do voter outreach. States and counties do voter education in terms of the process for voting and registration, et cetera. But first, I gotta just comment on Daniel's remarks a minute ago. In the interest of keeping this whole conversation fair and balanced, he argues there are certain things that are not insignificant in how people will decide to vote this November. So let me add a couple. Trump promised to build a wall. He hasn't built a wall, but he did build cages and tore asylum-seeking Latino families apart, including caging babies. That's not insignificant. The Trump administration has failed to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen not just the case count, but the death count skyrocket in the last couple of months, disproportionately impacting Latinos across the country and African Americans. So not just from a health standpoint, by the way, but also economically, not insignificant, and people will keep that in mind when they go to vote this November. Look, for purposes of voter education for this November, I spoke earlier about the security of vote by mail and why we will encourage people to try to protect their health and cast their ballots that way. Safety measures being incorporated into the in-person voting experience. All these options for voting and voting safely are minimal in their benefit if we don't educate voters about their options. So just to the same point that we're all saying, Latino voters deserve to hear, not just from candidates, not just from campaigns, but from state and local elections officials about this as well. It's one of the, I think, hidden powers of automatic voter registration. Increasingly, states are automatically registering eligible citizens when they apply for or renew their driver's license or their state ID. What that does is it puts them on the list, and all of a sudden, the state has to send you the voter information guide, and your local elections office has to send you maybe the sample ballot. When you're not registered, you're not getting that basic information of there's an election coming up, here's what we're voting on, and here's when, where, and how you can vote. To Chuck and Arturo's and others' point, yes, political parties and candidates need to be paying better attention. My good friend Tom Bettis, chair of the DNC, puts it best. Mobilizing is not organizing. Far too often, parties and candidates and campaigns show up, 60 days before election day and say, Viva this and Latino vote, and convince people to get out to the polls. We got to be investing and reaching out much earlier and more consistently not once every 2 years, not once every 4 years, forming that relationship with Latino voters and building that culture of civic engagement on a consistent, ongoing basis. So agree with everybody else who said that.
And trust. Thank you, Mr. Secretary of State Padilla. Now we'd like to shift to our Facebook questions from our viewers. So I will ask that we pull those up, please. Liz Magallanes asks, thank you for your work. Stephanie, she says, can you provide some resources that highlight the number of Latinas who make up those significant portions of the electorate in battleground states like Texas?
Yes, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that highlights a lot of this work and highlights the important role that Latinas play in the electorate. And if you visit our website at echisresearch.us, we have a lot of those numbers up on our website. The thing that I will just add, whether it's Arizona, Nevada, Texas, as I said earlier, Latinas generally are driving the growth of the electorate in these states, but specifically younger Latinas have a very critical role to play and are the largest share of the Latino electorate in many of these states. And so there's a huge opportunity to communicate with these women, through culturally competent means, through digital, radio, television, in ways and with messengers who will resonate most with them. And so I think that there's just a huge opportunity to take this as like a critical moment to reach Latino voters.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have a question from Alejandra Ramirez Zarate. What are proven strategies to increase the political efficacy and empowerment of Latinas throughout the country?
As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we've heard in our research and partner research about why Latinas are not turning out at the same levels as, say, Black and white women is because they don't feel prepared. And a lot of what that will take is real simple voter education about who is on the ballot. And there are a lot of women who will decide not to show up to the election or to vote because they don't want to mess up. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. We always want to be over prepared, and voting is no different. We don't want to make a mistake on behalf of our families. But the reality is that Latinas have all they need to go and vote, whether it's this election or any state or local election. And so a lot of that is just making sure they know who's on the ballot and what is on the ballot, what ballot measures there are, and what, not even a partisan message. And so there's just a huge opportunity to just get basic information to them.
Definitely, and taking advantage of the mail-in ballots. All right, so we're going to go to our next question. Let's see what we've got from Roberto Chiapeta. Given the increasing and more widespread momentum around social justice initiatives, how can corporations help support effective GOTV campaigns that steer clear of election campaign violations? Arturo, I will pass that question along to you.
You're going to have to repeat the question for me a bit.
Sure. Given the increasing and more widespread momentum around social justice initiatives, how can corporations help support effective GOTV campaigns that steer clear of election campaign violations?
Well, one thing is, I would say that corporations can certainly inform their employees about the importance of civic participation. Everything from making sure that their families are counted and everybody in their networks are counted in the census, but also that they're registered to vote and they are given the time to go cast the ballot. All of us by law are supposed to be given a certain amount of time off from work to be able to cast the ballots, and a corporation can do that. But there's also an investment opportunity, I think, for corporations, not just to invest in the work of organizations like NALEO Educational Fund. It's a little self-serving here, but many of us are doing this work as 501c3 nonpartisan organizations. And right now there is not sufficient resources being devoted to nonpartisan voter outreach. It's all being directed to very political partisan efforts run by C4 organizations and campaigns that focus on specific elections, focus on specific outcomes for elections. What we want to do is invest in the long term in creating that culture of civic participation. And that has to happen year in and year out with sustained investment in making sure that Latinos participate, not just in elections, but in every facet of civic life. And I think a partnership with corporations really offer an opportunity for us to work together to make that happen.
Chuck, can I call in Chuck now to maybe comment on this as well?
Thank you. And I was just thinking about Arturo had the right answer. And I think it starts with corporate responsibility. The first thing I would do if I was in this position was give everybody election day off. I would figure out how to cover that day somewhere else, sacrifice some other holiday. And I don't care what it is. One less day for Christmas, one less day for Thanksgiving. Like if you want your employees all to participate, and this is a non-partisan issue, give them a day off of work. We should have an election week. We should have election month. We should have people have every opportunity. If you're like my mom, and I write about this in the book T.O. Bernie, about my mother being 15 when I was born. She worked several jobs. We lived in a mobile home or a trailer house is what Daniel may call it. We're both Mexicans with good glasses from Texas next to their place, right? And so that meant if my grandmother wasn't home in the evening, who was going to watch the kids? Imagine all of that family's turmoil. And now you got to figure out how to vote and what time I got to be there. And if you vote like what's been happening here lately, you got to go stand in line for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. Who in their right mind in this country at this time, when we're the richest country on the face of the earth, why do you have to stand in line for 4 hours to go vote when you got to take care of your family?
Thank you so much, Chuck. Let's go on to the next question from Facebook from Marta y Gonzalez. If we know what that Latinx do vote, why are the parties not investing in them? And let's open up that question to Cristian Ramos.
Yeah, this is a big question. This is a really big question. And I have been doing this for 10 years, 20 years, if you want to be charitable, right? If you want to start with sort of organizing work that I've done out in Arizona, growing up. Look, I think they want to. I think they absolutely need to. I think, we have a lot of conversations about resources. We just heard from Arturo and we just heard from Chuck about sort of the resources thing. I think there is also a fundamental misunderstanding about how to talk to Latinos and how to speak to them in ways that are culturally relevant. Working is an incredibly important thing to Latinos. It is a part of our culture, being able to work. And so if we're talking about a pandemic that has wiped out the ability for Latinos to work, let's hear solutions for how we get people back to work, and let's tie that back to voting. One of my experiences working as a mayor, working for the mayor of Washington, D.C., I'll never forget, we did a bunch of ACA town halls, and everybody that came to these town halls for the ACA wanted to know how to get their kid into a better school. They wanted to know, they would always come in and talk in Spanish, and they'd want to talk about education and how to get their kids there. That's the stuff that the party should be investing in and harnessing those messages and reaching those voters. Because I would argue every single person in America right now has a phone and is on their phone during this pandemic. That's my daughter. And they're always on it. So let's find a way to reach them on their phone. Let's find a way to reach them where they live. And let's go there. I don't think this is rocket science, to Chuck's point. And I don't think it costs a ton to do. Let's just get after it is really my view on all this.
And modernize the message and be very efficient when it comes to that. Arturo, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, and I think, part of the problem is that we have a political system that's lazy. We have a political system that focuses on the likeliest of voters. And if you vote in every single election, campaigns and candidates know exactly who you are. And if you are an unlikely voter or someone who's just going to vote for the first time and you don't have a voting history, they ignore you. And there's a focus on these battleground states. So if you live in Ohio, if you live in Michigan, if you live in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, you can almost guarantee someone's going to be knocking on your door, or maybe not this year, but someone will be reaching out to you and asking for your vote. But if you live in Texas or California or New York or Illinois, candidates assume what the outcome's going to be. So those states get ignored. The problem with that for Latinos is that more than half of the Latino electorate lives in California and Texas alone. And if you ignore those two states, you ignore 1 out of every 2 Latino voters in the country. Second, second point, and I know Chuck is going to love me for saying this, you have to hire people who know the Latino community in order to do effective Latino outreach. And I think Chuck is an example of a consultant who really has figured out what campaigns need to do to reach Latino voters.
Definitely. And we'd like to bring in Alex Padilla again, also commenting from Ado Gonzalez. He said, both parties have ignored the Latinos, Hispanics, or Mexican Americans. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, just in concurring with Arturo, concurring with Chuck and everybody else, what I wanted to point out was the dynamic of, look, what does government do? What does the state do? What does the county do? They have to treat every voter equally. So the voter information guides, reminders to vote, etc. That's different than in campaigns. So how I wanted to describe the sad existing dynamic is the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And I've seen it as a candidate, and I've been involved with my party, finite resources, right? You're raising money, have a campaign budget to work with, and it's always disproportionately targeted, as others have said, to people who are very, 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 very likely to vote, because they're going to vote and you're trying to persuade them. And there's this discouragement of, well, don't try to communicate to people who hardly ever vote, because they're not likely to vote. That's going to be wasted money. So then they vote less because they're not being reached out to more. So it's that self-fulfilling prophecy or downward spiral of participation, if you will. As Chuck has demonstrated, when you invest, when you do communicate, when you do ask somebody for their vote, their chances of voting goes up. And so between making it easier to register through the government side, communicating to the voters, and then campaigns paying more attention to newly registered voters, once we get that cycle of participation going within a family, then they're much more likely to be regular voters over time and for the long term, not just in any particular election.
Of course, and you make them feel valued and important as well. I'll also ask you from Debbie Reyes, ballot tracking should be a national service, she says.
I couldn't agree more. But the fact of the matter is, in the Constitution of the United States, it does say states run elections. The federal government can play a role if they put some money on the table to condition some of that money for states to develop and offer those ballot tracking systems. But states, look, there's no prohibition. States who are willing to do the right thing can do it now. California has had it in a couple of counties in prior elections. We're expanding it to be statewide for this November, and hoping to influence other states by our successful example.
All right. Daniel, would you like to say something else about this topic as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, look, keep in mind that the vast majority of Latinos are not wired left and they're not wired right. They're not baked in for anybody. And like Chuck was saying, you have to earn their vote and you have to engage them. But what I would say that's really important, I think in an era of social distancing, it's now more important than ever to connect, ironically, right? But you have to do that not through a silver bullet. There is not one thing that you do to engage Latinos and to inform them and cut through the traffic and the noise, like you were saying. You have to do media. You have to do Spanish and English language, mainstream, local, regional. You have to do print. You have to do digital. You have to do television, radio. It's block walk. It's the hard work of making the phone calls to fellow Latinos. It's mail. It's events. It's editorials. It's whatever it takes to reach young women, business leaders, faith. Lo que sea. We have agrupaciones and diversity like everybody else does. So if we're stuck on, well, we're going to hire a Latino, that's not just it, right? You have to hire Latinos, and then you have to do all this other layered work to cut through the noise.
And that definitely agrees with Claudia Marroquin from Meta's comment. She said, there isn't a one-size-fits-all for Latinos. Latinos are both Democrat and Republican. They are informed, not all uninformed. So great information. Thank you so much. I think I saw that Chuck wanted to comment as well. Chuck, can we get you in here as well?
Thank you, Nicole. Let me say this real quick, and this is for all of you who've been out there working in the campaign world. You're going to hear politicians and organizations saying, oh, we do good in the Latino community. We work with Latino community. We've got this Zoom call this evening in the Latino community. That's not the same as spending resources. What everybody has said very eloquently is all right, whether you're left or right down the middle. But the key here, going back to the resources, you can have all the best ideas in the world, but if you're not delivering the message, it doesn't work. I have this debate all the time with intellectuals who went to Harvard and
I think we are having some connectivity issues. So we will wrap it up there. Do we have any more Facebook questions? Roger Casares says, thanks. Robert Chiapeta says, thank you, Arturo and Chuck, for your thoughtful responses. And definitely thank you to everyone, our great panelists today, for giving us their insight on this important topic, the Latino vote. So important. We have to reiterate the importance of registering to vote, actually going out the next election cycle, 3 de noviembre, 3rd of November, to actually participate in these elections. So thank you so much to everybody who watched today and everybody who participated. I'd like to hand it over again to Arturo. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. And I have to do a little shameless plug and put telemundo.com/Decisions 20 if you'd like to find any information about registering to vote and mail-in voting as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you again for moderating. You know, we love seeing your work as a Telemundo Noticias correspondent. It's great to see your fantastic journalism. And so thank you for joining us for this session. To our national media partner, Comcast, NBC Universal Telemundo, muchísimas gracias. Without your partnership, our work would not be possible, as well as to our presenting sponsor, Microsoft, our patron sponsor, Bayer US, and to our panelists who helped us explore these issues. My good friend, Secretary Alex Padilla, Stephanie Valencia, Chuck Rocha, Christian Ramos, and Daniel Garza. Yes, Chuck, I think you need to pay your internet bill, or either that or Harvard got mad at you and didn't let you finish what you were going to say about them. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to everybody who's watching. You know, we have had to pivot all of our work and move to this virtual space, and it is certainly a disadvantage. I would love to have been in Milwaukee this year with many of you, and then in Charlotte as well, to engage with you person to person and to have these conversations face to face. But we're not able to do that. On the other hand, I think we're able to reach a phenomenal number of people through this effort in this virtual space. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you would like to join us if you can in just about an hour as we repeat this, but in Spanish. We'll have some faces come back from this panel and have some new faces join us. So in the meantime, please stay safe, be well, y nos vemos a las 3 de la tarde, tiempo del este, o a mediodía, tiempo pacífico. Gracias.